Assalamu alaikum and welcome to The Report. I'm Yasmin Khatoon and I'll be taking a look at the stories that matter to you. We will be discussing news stories from throughout the week and the ones that you've all been talking about. On The Report, we do love to hear what you think, so to join the conversation, get tweeting using #The Report. Later on in the programme, we'll be going through the topics that have been trending throughout the week. But before we get into the conversation, let's have a look at some of the week's news.
Following the publication of forensic tests, scientists have confirmed that Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat was poisoned to death in 2004 with radioactive polonium.
If I was a judge and jury, this is absolutely stone cold certain. This is beyond any doubt, in my opinion, that it was polonium that caused the death of Yasser Arafat.
A team of experts opened Arafat's grave in the West Bank city of Ramallah last November and took samples from his body to seek evidence of alleged poisoning.
أنا بعتقد إنه هذا الأمر يستوجب أن يكون هناك لجنة قضائية دولية لتبعت هذا الأمر ومحاسبة من ارتكب هذه الجريمة بحق الشهيد ياسر عرفات لأن الذي له مصلحة في عملية قتله هو الاحتلال.
Hamas have called upon the Palestinian Authority to stop peace negotiations with Israel in light of the findings, requesting an inner Palestinian investigation. Allegations of foul play surfaced immediately after the leader's death. The Israeli government have denied any role in his death, noting that he was 75 years old and had an unhealthy lifestyle. Suha Arafat, the wife of the former leader, has added she is shocked and angered by the contents of the report, and that she would pursue the case through the courts in France and elsewhere until the perpetrators were brought to justice.
My daughter and myself will not stop. It's very important to separate the political aspect of what the Palestinian Authority is doing, negotiations, and the crime of Yasser Arafat. It's a separate subject. We have to continue regardless what is asked from us politically. Political peace process will go on their side, and the investigation of a very shameful crime like this crime has to go on another side, on another path.
This comes as further violence continues in the region. In the early hours of this morning, it was confirmed that Israeli soldiers killed a Palestinian after he had used a makeshift gun to shoot fireworks at Israelis in the occupied West Bank. The violence coincided with efforts by visiting US Secretary of State John Kerry to push forward peace talks and avoid what he warned could be a third intifada. 9 Palestinians have been shot dead by Israeli soldiers since the US-sponsored peace negotiations resumed in July after a 3-year freeze. Israel has rejected a mooted world powers deal with Iran, aimed at ending a long-running row over its nuclear ambitions.
Israel utterly rejects it, and what I'm saying is shared by many, many in the regions, whether or not they express it publicly. Israel is not obliged by this agreement, and Israel will do everything it needs to do to defend itself and to defend the security of its people.
Israel has repeatedly warned that it might strike Iran if it did not halt its nuclear program, accusing Tehran of seeking to build atomic weapons. The United States has said world powers will consider relaxing some economic sanctions against Iran if it takes verifiable steps to limit its nuclear program. Israel has called for the sanctions to remain in place until Iran has dismantled its entire enrichment program. Former military ruler of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf, has been released from house arrest. He has been granted bail in a series of court cases. Musharraf returned to Pakistan from self-exile in March this year to run in the May general elections, but was barred from contesting and embroiled in a series of criminal activities dating back to his 1999 to 2008 rule. He has been under house arrest since the May elections, faced with murder trials over the assassination of former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto and Baloch tribal leader Nawab Akbar Bugti. He was also charged over allegations of illegally detaining judges during a crackdown on the judiciary in 2007. He was also charged over allegations of illegally detaining judges during a crackdown on the judiciary in 2007. He was granted bail in all 3 of those cases.
The farmhouse of General Musharraf was declared sub-jail in April this year. And after the admission of his bail in all the 4 cases, the release order, and pursuant to the release order issued by the superintendent of jail, the status of his house as sub-jail is now changed, and that order has been denotified.
Bangladeshi former Prime Minister and opposition leader Khalida Zia has said that dialogue over the election time government is not able to proceed because of the incumbent government's reluctance to engage in talks with the opposition. This comes as tensions rise ahead of the elections that are due by January.
আমি আজও বলছি ব্যবসায়ীদের প্রস্তাব অনুযায়ী 2 দলের মহাসচিব পর্যায়ে আলোচনা শুরুর জন্য আমরা এখনো অপেক্ষা করছি। আমি আশা করব সরকার সংলাপের পথ ফিরে আসবেন। যে সকল রাজনৈতিক দল, সিভিল সমাজের সদস্য, পেশাজীবী, বুদ্ধিজীবী, নির্দলীয় নিরপেক্ষ সরকারের অধীনে
Khalida Zia urged her party activists and supporters to intensify the anti-government movement. Bangladesh has been rocked by protests and counter-protests since January, when the International Crimes Tribunal, set up by the government to investigate abuses during the 1971 War of Independence from Pakistan, sentenced to death leaders from the biggest Islamic party in the country, Jamaat-e-Islami. An Egyptian court has decided that the trial of Egypt's first elected president, Mohamed Morsi, is to be postponed until January next year. The trial, held at the police academy in eastern New Cairo, was suspended for more than an hour as anti-coup protesters chanted slogans against the court and the military. The trial comes 4 months on from a military coup, in which Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi removed the country's president, Mohamed Morsi, from power. Scenes outside the court included multiple checkpoints, extensive security personnel, and barbed wire.
أنا هنا عشان خاطر المحاكمة المزعومة اللي هم بيدعوا إن محاكمة الرئيس.
The strongest typhoon in the world this year has forced more than 1 million people to flee their homes, cutting power lines and blowing apart houses. Category 5 super typhoon scoured the northern tip of Cebu province and headed west towards Boracay Island. An average of 20 typhoons hit the Philippines every year. Last year, Typhoon Boffa flattened 3 coastal towns on Mindanao and killed 1,100 people. Haiyan is the 24th such storm to hit the Philippines this year. Rayan Clementson, Islam Channel.
Now, a lot of stories there. With me to discuss some of those stories is academic Sayed Al-Alawi and campaigner Martin Linton. Also joining me later on in the programme will be Ahmed Babat from Queen Mary University of London and Omar Ali, the president of FOSIS, the Federation of Student Islamic Societies. Now, lots of different stories there. The first thing I do want to touch upon is Yasser Arafat. Now, the Palestinian Liberation Force, they're asking for an inquiry. Will we see an impact from any inquiry, Martin?
Well, I think the Palestinians already made up their minds 8 years ago that Yasser Arafat was murdered by the Israelis, and the news this week will have not surprised them, but it will have confirmed them in that belief.
Well, Hamas actually said that they didn't want to jump to any conclusions. Yes, they wanted negotiations to come to a halt, but they said it could be anyone. Yasser Arafat had many enemies.
Well, yes, but I mean, not everybody can go down to the local shop and buy some polonium-210. And you know, Israel certainly has the capability, and it has the record. It has, of course, clearly assassinated a lot of Palestinian leaders. It tried to assassinate Khaled Mashal when he was in Jordan. It carried out a very elaborate assassination in Kuwait a couple of years ago using British passports, if you remember, and of course it's carried out many assassinations in Gaza. So it has the record, and of course it has the motive. You could say, well, it could have been somebody else, but I mean, the important point is that it's too late now, 8 years after his death, to prove anything beyond doubt. I mean, a court of law, I don't think would accept the evidence. It would accept probably the evidence that polonium was used, but there's nothing actually definite to link the Israelis. But people are going to believe that, and I believe it myself.
Saeed, if I can bring you in, Israel have flat out denied any involvement in any of this. Martin saying there that we can't prove anything anyway, whatever the case. What are we looking for to get out of this with an inquiry?
Basically, there is no clear conclusion yet, and they haven't completely come out with clear, let's say, outcome. But yes, there is a history of assassinations of the Palestinian activists by the Israeli government. But the outcome, no matter how come up, one thing is very important, and this will definitely overshadow the negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. Particularly, we need to pay attention that what we have in terms of negotiations between Israel and Palestine is the continuation of late Yasser Arafat's policies. So, and on one hand, we see Mahmoud Abbas. That creates a kind of dilemma for him. Because on one hand, he has to show that he's quite interested in a follow-up in order to convince the Palestinian streets. On the other hand, he must somehow act in a way not to overshadow the peace process, presumably.
Well,
but they need to internationalize this case.
John Kerry is still optimistic for negotiations. Hamas has said negotiations need to stop. Benjamin Netanyahu is saying there in the news report that Iran, with their nuclear, was starting off a new, different conversation, saying that what's going on, there's too much. Iran should be very happy with what's taken place, and they're certainly not.
Well, I think there's no doubt the talks will go on until May. They're due to last 9 months, and I don't see them being abandoned. But there's absolutely no. I mean, there's very little optimism in my mind that they will lead to anything. I mean, I think we must give credit to John Kerry for persuading the two sides to sit down on the table together, but he's not doing what is necessary to bring the two sides to an agreement. He's more or less left them to get on with it, and I don't think anything will come of it. Netanyahu is always very keen to talk about Iran in order to take attention away from what's happening in his own backyard in Israel and the West Bank. That's not to say that it's not an important subject, but we know he has an additional motive for constantly trying to change the subject to talk about Iran.